So our first case study for totalitarianism is the Soviet Union. Now, before we move on to Stalin, we should continue our conversation about Lenin, since we left off discussing Lenin following the Bolshevik Revolution. So first, let's get a sense of how Lenin ultimately took Marxism and interpreted it in his own way. So we would refer to his philosophy as both Marxist and Leninist, kind of a combination of the two. One thing that's important for us to know about Lenin is that he was very much against imperialism. His belief was that imperialism is the highest form of capitalism. Basically, imperialists, what they're doing is they're searching for new markets and raw materials just to feed the bourgeois class, right? The bourgeois wants to make more profit. Ultimately, they can't completely do it within the confines of their country, so therefore they seek to expand their, ultimately their empire, right? The idea behind imperialism, according to Lenin, was that in order to feed the bourgeoisie, in order to extend capitalism, the people that are conquered, or the people that are subject to imperialism, are ruthlessly exploited, right? It's yet another example of the haves versus have-nots. So in addition to just talking about industrialism, Lenin definitely wanted to point out other areas in which capitalism was exploitative, like in the age of imperialism that preceded World War I. So what Lenin was attempting to do was create a new type of party, right, beyond just the Marxist philosophy, but something that would apply specifically to that day and age. Again, we discussed this going into the Bolshevik Revolution slightly, but remember that Lenin differed from Marx because he actually believed that there should actually be a group of educated professionals, right, who are serving the communist revolution, or the change over to communism in a place like the Soviet Union. That it can't be, like Marx said, just a dictatorship of the proletariat. All right, it's not that the workers can just suddenly start to rule over the capitalist class, because that was such a long-standing tradition. It would be difficult to institute that type of revolution. So again, Lenin felt like there were actually people who needed to make communism their full-time job, right, to successfully achieve revolution. So this is different from Marx, who just thought that it was going to come from below. Marx and Lenin both had it in common that they wanted communism to be worldwide, right, so not stop at a country's borders. 1919, you have the creation of the Comintern. Now, we've already had the First and Second Communist International as organizations that we discussed. That was chapter 25, if you want to have a review on that. But the Comintern is the Third Communist International. It's an international communist organization that's, again, trying to promote world communism. So, the idea is that it's not supposed to stop just in the Soviet Union. And actually, with the creation of the Comintern, this actually sort of fuels the Red Scare in Western Europe and in the United States as well, right? Because they feel like, communism is not just going to stop with the Bolshevik Revolution. So, actually, just really briefly before we move on, also remember that another thing that Lenin incorporates during the Bolshevik Revolution was this concept of war communism, which was basically a way of applying total war to the Russian economy, with the intent of defeating the White Russians, right? This was the goal for the Bolsheviks, to win the Russian Civil War, right? So basically, it completely socializes and nationalizes all means of production. It makes the planning of the economy completely centralized. The government actually set quotas for every element of production under war communism. But actually, what's interesting is that this doesn't work. So basically, instead of I guess a positive effect on production, actually there's mass starvation, there's crop failures, right? I mean, the idea is that you can't completely predict what a crop yield is going to be. This is why the invisible hand of capitalism, in some ways, people would argue, is more effective, right? Supply and demand are, a very logical relationship. You're not able to ultimately create a product out of nowhere, right? Whereas in a communist economy where there are actual quotas set, right? You could actually make an impossible prediction for how much would be produced. So basically, because of these quotas, what ends up happening is that there's a lot of crop failures, right? They can't produce as much as the government wanted. Also, it results in a decrease in industrial output. So war communism sort of destroys the economy. Also, what you see under war communism, this in an attempt to enforce this centralized economy, the Cheka was very active. Remember the secret police, the same people that killed the Romanovs? And actually, they liquidate 250,000, and when I say liquidate, I mean kill, 250,000 opponents to this new communist economy. So again, you know, even if the economy was ultimately destroyed, with the activeness of the Cheka, you know, this sort of complete control of the economy was able to persist because people just couldn't resist it. All right, so by the time you get to the 1920s, there is a realization after the failing of the economy under war communism that there are definitely people living in the Soviet Union that are not particularly happy with the new structure of the economy. So this is 1921. We have an event called the Kronstadt Rebellion. All right, and this is interesting because it was actually instituted by previously pro-Bolshevik people. They were sailors, so they had a role in the Bolshevik military, right? But ultimately, they are very disillusioned by the economic disaster that took place under war communism during the Russian Civil War. There's also a lot of social upheaval because, again, people are totally starving. So these previously pro-Bolshevik sailors stage a mutiny in a naval base called Kronstadt, hence the name, right? Again, they're hungry. You know, it's not too far off from the reasons for many mutinies and protests in history, right? Completely disillusioned by all the starvation of the war, they don't like war communism, and they're also very upset with the fact that the government just released the Cheka on anybody who opposed them. So actually, an interesting saying that came about was that these previously pro-Bolshevik people said that because of the ruthless government enforcement, the hammer and sickle, which is, of course, the symbol of communism, was replaced by the bayonet and barred window, so that gives you a sense of how they feel. And this is sort of exacerbated by the fact that the Kronstadt Rebellion is mowed down. The state ends up just completely crushing these sailors with machine gun fire when they decide to protest. So again, it shows you how ruthless the government is in trying to maintain the type of state that it's designed. All right, but what even if the Kronstadt Rebellion was a failure in itself, what it demonstrates is that war communism was not a successful way to regulate the economy. It also just shows us how many problems existed after the Russian Civil War, and it gives Lenin a huge indicator that he needs to do something to modify economic policy, or else there are going to be serious repercussions. So Lenin decides to institute this new economic policy, or the NEP. It lasts for 7 years in the 1920s, and interestingly what it is it's actually bringing back some elements of capitalism to the Russian economy. And why is that? Well, realize that, you know, in order to completely institute a communist economy, that might be too much of a revolution for a population that is, well, incredibly large and also has been sort of under the same social structure for hundreds of years. Realize that it was only recently, it was only during the Bolshevik period that peasants got land for the first time, right? So they might not be willing to completely surrender to government quotas so quickly. So that's one of the huge problems. You can't just give peasants land and then immediately tell them exactly what they can produce. What the government was doing under war communism was it was seizing surplus grain. It was making it so that peasants could not sell any grain on the open market, right? And this is one of the reasons why the Kronstadt Rebellion breaks out. You know, people are starving because they are unable to actually eat whatever they're producing because the government takes it first. So the new economic policy goes back a little bit. Lenin argues that it's a necessary step backwards. Still, the ultimate goal is to impose communism, but in a more gradual way. Okay, so what the government stops doing is seizing grain the way that it did under war communism. It also means that any surplus that peasants create, they can actually sell for a profit. And what this does is it actually increases production. I mean, if the government is ultimately going to take everything that you produce, what would be an incentive to produce any more? The whole reason why people create surpluses is because they can make additional money off of it. They can profit off of it. But there's no incentive there if the government is taking everything left over. So under the new economic policy, what happens is that the surplus that's created is actually going to encourage the peasants to produce more. All right, so again, because the population of the peasants was so large and they ultimately couldn't be turned into state workers overnight, this was one of the reasons why Lenin decided on the new economic policy. He felt like making a deal with the peasants, at least temporarily, to introduce some capitalism back to the economy was necessary. You also saw that small manufacturers were able to run their businesses instead of having the government set quotas for them. Now, some limits to the new economic policy. The government was still in charge of heavy industry, right? So things like steel development, petroleum. It was still in control of running banks, and it was still in control of railroad development. So making sure that Russia continued to catch up with the West was still very much on the Russian government's mind, and they were not willing to completely allow the economy to be privatized again. So the NEP actually works. The Russian economy does improve to a certain extent. What we see is that the output industrially was actually back to the pre-World War I levels. So a lot of this is because the sort of profit motive that is introduced by allowing peasants to sell their surplus products was effective, right? People want to be able to, profit off of whatever their surplus is. Also, workers were happy with the fact that they had a little bit more control over their schedules. They could work shorter hours, and they had better working conditions. No longer were these, sort of harsh government quotas making them work ridiculously long hours and in very bad conditions, right? Also, the government was no longer imposing some of the very brutal institutions of censorship and terror with institutions like the Cheka, right? Partly because with new profit motive, there's less of a need to try to enforce the economic production. So basically, Cheka is no longer needed to kind of terrorize people into producing. So this also makes the NEP pretty successful. So in general, before we move on to Stalin, how Russia changes under Lenin. I mean, first and foremost, the very significant change is that Russia is transformed into the Soviet Union in 1922, the first communist country that is established in Europe. So this is one of the most monumental global impacts. All right, also you're going to see the old social structure is going to completely break down. There will no longer be titles for nobility. There is at least an attempt on the outside to establish more of an equal playing field socially and economically for the whole population. Also, religion is going to decline, right? The Greek Orthodox Church was previously the dominant religion in Russia. What you're going to see is that in order to fully enforce communism, the state becomes secular, right? The idea is that communism ultimately is the religion of the state. So religion will decline. In theory, women gain equality. You're going to see more women go to work. More women also start to increase their education, emerge into more professional fields, even like medicine, which we'll talk about more under Stalin. Also, Russians at least had the expectation of freedom, right? They thought that under this new type of economic structure, also once you sort of get to the new economic policy with a less of a harsh sort of police state in place, with the Cheka having a little bit less influence and imposing less terror, there was the expectation of the population that they were more free than they were under Tsarist Russia. But what we're going to see is that when Stalin takes control, his very harsh institution of 5-year plans is actually going to completely crush people's expectations of freedom. We are going to move on to talk about Stalin in the next video. So make sure that you are really consciously contrasting Lenin's economic policies and the extent to which there's a little bit of give, like with the new economic policy, and Stalin's harshness with his 5-year plans.